go out of mic if that's okay. Can you hear me in the back of the room? Fine? Okay, good. Many of you remember where you were at certain points of time in your life. I certainly do. My dad was a sophomore at Purdue University in a fraternity on December 7th, 1941. He was walking up on that afternoon from the bottom floor to his room, and along the stairway he heard on the radio a report of the attack on Pearl Harbor. He was trying to figure out whether to go see a movie or to study. He didn't do either because of what he heard on the radio, and a year later he was in China. Hang on, this thing is not working. He was in China flying C-47s from India to Kunming, China, over the Burma Hump. Let me see if this is going to work. There we go. Many of you remember the TV show Eddie Haskell and Leave It to Beaver. This is not Eddie Haskell, this is me in 7th grade. And why is this significant? Because in 7th grade I remember when the teacher walked in and told us that President Kennedy had been shot in Dallas, and I was in Shreveport, Louisiana at the time. This is me again in 1969. I worked at a camp in England called Camp Mohawk, had an Indian theme, as you can see. And I remember looking at a very small television, black and white television, at 3 o'clock in the morning when I saw Neil Armstrong take his steps on the moon and say, "One small step for man, one giant leap for mankind." And this is me about 20 years ago when I was a deputy commander of U.S. Army Pacific in Hawaii. Not a bad assignment, quite frankly. But I wasn't in Hawaii on September 11th. I was in Washington, D.C. attending a conference. I was at the DoubleTree Hotel. You can see it here on the right-hand side of the screen. And I was exactly 2,700 feet from the point of impact, which you see over here. This is the Pentagon right here. How many of you have been to Washington, D.C. and seen the Pentagon? Who's been inside the Pentagon? Okay, so some of you know a little bit about this building. For those who don't know something about it, I'm going to tell you a little bit about it before I get into the events of that day. Construction began eerily on September 11th, 1940. It took 60 years before the attack of 9/11. 4,000 workers, and after the attack on Pearl Harbor, they raised that to 15,000 workers. It was completed in 16 months. It was first conceived to be a temporary building that they would hold government archives in. That was the original plan after the war. But they started it, as you can see, well before the war actually started because they saw the winds of war coming. And they knew that the Department of War, which was scattered all over Washington, D.C., needed to be consolidated somewhere. The Pentagon is a result. Although it's called the Puzzle Palace, it's a very efficient building, to be very honest with you. 5 floors, 5 sides, 5 concentric rings. It's the largest low-rise building in the world. 6 million square feet, 17.5 miles of hallways and corridors. You can walk anywhere in 7 minutes, from one corner to the farthest corner away. 25,000 employees on any given day with another 3,000 to 5,000 visitors. There were only about 22,000 in the building on 9/11 because they were renovating the Pentagon at the time, and about 3,000 people were in temporary office spaces in Crystal City, Arlington, Alexandria, and in the surrounding area. We'll get into that a little bit more later. It's affectionately called the Puzzle Palace by people that work there. It houses the National Military Command Center, where I worked for 2 years when I was a brigadier general. I was the guy who had keys around my neck that if World War III started, we would actually launch missiles. Not from the Pentagon, we would launch messages to the people who would launch missiles, but I was the guy that would have been talking to the president saying, "Mr. President, you have 23 minutes before a nuclear round lands in New York City." And quite frankly, we practiced blowing up the world on a regular basis to make sure that we were very good at it, because it was a very short distance coming over the Arctic Circle from Russia. And they still have that command center, headed up by a brigadier general, about 30 people on the team, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. I did that job for 22 months. Now, when the World Trade Center was hit, The north tower was hit first at 8:46 in the morning. The south tower was hit at 9:03 a.m. Anybody in here in New York on 9/11? Okay, one, two. When I give this presentation, I know there's a visceral reaction by some people in the audience sometimes because they were touched by this event. They were either there or they knew somebody that was there. And time permitting, I always ask people to tell their story. I don't think we're going to have the time today. But I know all of you have a story about where you were. This is American Airline Flight 77's flight path. This is the airplane that hit the Pentagon. And you can see it came into Washington, D.C. from the north. You can see it took a great big circle before it hit the Pentagon. And so there is a theory, which I happen to believe, that the Pentagon was never the primary target for this airplane. It was the White House. But if you are flying a large commercial airplane at over 500 miles per hour, you're going to have a difficult time finding the White House, and you'll see why in a minute. Plus, if you've practiced and learned how to fly an airplane in a Piper Cub, which is what the guy who was at the controls actually did. Anybody a commercial pilot or a pilot in here? Okay, so you all kind of know what I'm talking about. These guys they went down to Florida, they learned how to fly an airplane, not to take off and land, but how to basically steer, and the basics of flying the airplane. And then they graduated from a Piper Cub into a commercial airline. And they came in from the north. We all believe that the original target was the White House, but as you can see, the White House is a very small building. Anybody who's flown into National Airport, you can see the Washington Monument, you can see the Capitol. It's very difficult to see the White House because it's surrounded by trees, and there's a lot of white buildings around it as well. So it sort of blends in. When you're moving that fast, coming from the north, it's going to be tough to see. I have a video here. The sound is not very good, but it's as high as it can go, so bear with me. These are actual recordings from the event that day. If it works. Well, doesn't appear that it's going to work. Anyway, this is the impact. This was taken by a security camera that was at a parking entrance for the south parking area, and that's a still that was taken from that video of the airplane actually hitting the building. My nephew, who's a retired Marine, was a lance corporal working in the Navy Annex, not too far from the Pentagon, about half a mile along the path of the final approach for that airplane. And he heard the airplane come over the top of the building. So the conspiracy theorists that think that the FBI or somebody like that blew up the building with things, it's not true. An airplane did hit the Pentagon. This is kind of interesting. 34 minutes after the South Tower hit, the Pentagon was hit, and this is the point of impact where you see the arrow. I'm going to talk a little bit about this circle on the left-hand side. It says on the small print, not yet renovated. I mentioned earlier the Pentagon was under renovation. It was under renovation because in the 80s and 90s there were terrorist attacks around the world against U.S. interests by truck bombs. Timothy McVeigh blew up a building in Oklahoma City. We had buildings blown up in Saudi Arabia. We had embassies blown up. So there was an awareness of the tactic that terrorists were using to use large explosives to blow up buildings. And so the decision was made to start hardening key potential targets, like symbolic targets like the Pentagon, and it was under a multi-year, more than $1 billion renovation to turn what originally was nothing more than bricks and mortar into steel reinforced concrete, mylar windows, and the like. The section that you see here in the circle had not yet been renovated, but the section where the impact was made had been renovated, and you'll see the difference on this next photo. This is a photograph that was taken the day of the attack. You can see fire coming out here. I'm going to talk about my own role here in a moment, but I was standing right here next to this fire truck on the morning of September 11th after we stopped the conference that I was part of. And I remember looking at the hole in the wall, and the windows on the left and the right were still intact. So this airplane, full of fuel, hit the building, went through a good portion of it, not all of it, but went through a good portion of it. The explosion, the concussion, did not blow the windows out because of the renovation that had already been done on that portion of the building. It did blow the windows out down here on the portion that had not yet been renovated. You can see the fire coming out of that window. So it attests to the fact that this plan to reinforce the building actually worked pretty well. There were only less than 200 people killed in the Pentagon. 25,000 people worked there. Why? Because they hit a side of the building that was under renovation, and many people were gone. They were in temporary office spaces in other locations. The organization that was hosting the conference I was attending at the DoubleTree Hotel had their office spaces right here. They had 44 people in the hotel with me that survived. They left 2 secretaries in the building. Both of them were killed. Here's an angle of the airplane. It came in just a few feet off the ground when it hit the building. The Pentagon has 5 rings. The E ring is on the outside, the A ring is on the inside, and it goes E, D, C, B, A. The airplane went through the E ring and the D ring and a portion of the C ring. It did not go through the B ring or the A ring, the 2 inner rings. If this airplane would have hit a portion of the building that had not yet been renovated, I believe, and I'm not an engineer, but I believe it would have gone through like a hot knife through butter, all the way to the center of the building. This is the next day, and you can see all these tents set up out here. This green circle I'm going to talk about in a moment is kind of where the command center was located. This is the same location that the fire truck was at in the previous photo that you saw. I remember when the plane hit the North Tower, we were told about it in the conference at the DoubleTree Hotel. And we thought, wow, what an unfortunate accident that was. When the plane hit the second tower, we knew it wasn't an accident. So we asked the hotel to put a television into the conference room. We were below ground in the DoubleTree Hotel, 2,700 feet from the point of impact. We did not hear the airplane hit the Pentagon because we were below ground. Somebody ran in and said there's been an explosion at the Pentagon. I ran outside along with everybody else. We saw this black plume of smoke coming up. I tried to call my wife on my cell phone. Couldn't get through. She was in Hawaii. It was 4 a.m. in Hawaii. I went up to my hotel room. I called her. I said, please call the command center in Hawaii. Tell them I'm okay. I'm not in the Pentagon. And then call my parents who were in Indiana and tell them I'm okay, because they knew I was attending a Pentagon-hosted meeting in Washington, D.C. And then I went over to the Pentagon and spent the next 2 days there trying to help, because all the airplanes were grounded. I couldn't get back to Hawaii. I spent much of my time right here. After I got there, somebody got on a megaphone and said, get away from the building, there's another airplane coming. And we didn't know where that airplane was coming from or what its target was. So everybody ran across this highway that you see on the left-hand side of the screen until the all clear was given. And then we came back. I remember standing next to an FBI agent at one point, and he said to me, I asked him if there was a command center somewhere, because it was not clear. Anybody in the fire department or from a fire department? Okay, so you all know that the first responders, the question at this time was who's in charge, because everybody thought they were in charge. I mean, this is Washington, D.C. We had Maryland responding, we had Virginia responding, we had the federal government, the county government, the local government, we had sheriffs, we had policemen, we had the Pentagon police, we had more brass than you can imagine in the military. Everybody thought they were in charge. I learned from this experience that the person in charge is really the fire chief, the senior fire chief. And so the Arlington County Fire Chief was the guy who was in charge. Why? Because you got to put out the fire, you got to save lives. That's the immediate task. I remember standing next to him and asking him, is there anything the military can provide? Had nothing to do. I was in uniform. I was a 2-star general at the time. He said, yeah, I could use some blocking and bracing material to hold up the sides of the building. You can see the building collapsed on the right-hand side. And they were concerned about going in there looking for survivors or recovering bodies. So I called the 3rd Infantry Regiment nearby at Fort Myer, Virginia. They have an engineer company. They're the ceremonial unit for the Army in Washington, D.C. They're the ones that bury people at Arlington Cemetery and so forth. But they have a wartime mission. And they had an engineer company. And I said, do you have anything that can help this fire chief? They said, yes, we do. Our engineer company has blocking and bracing material. So about 2 hours later, I'm standing somewhere in this area. None of these tents were here then. This picture was taken the next day. And trucks start rolling in from the right-hand side over here. And this FBI agent turns to me and he says, what's all that? And I said, well, those are from the 3rd Infantry Regiment. They're bringing in blocking and bracing material. Why do you ask? He said, they're driving over my crime scene. And so it says something about the difference in perspective between the fire chief, who's trying to put out the fire and save lives, and the FBI. And this is no hit on the FBI or law enforcement. I love them just like I love the firemen, but it's a very different perspective. For him, it was a crime scene that needed to be protected. These trucks were driving over the top of it and disturbing the crime scene. And there were pieces of airplane laying out here in the grass. That was burnt grass at the time. A little bit later, I'm standing out there and I'm still trying to figure out, who's in charge of what. Is there any central coordination? And I'm standing next to a different FBI agent and I asked him, are you aware of any central place where there's coordination being occurring? He said, well, the Arlington County Sheriff Department has put up a command van up at the Navy Annex, which is about a half-mile away. And he said, I'm going up there. Would you like to go? And I said, sure. So we get into his SUV. It's a black SUV like you see in the movies, tinted windows, antennas coming off top, look-in radios everywhere. And I said, what do you do? He said, I'm the chief of counterterrorism for the FBI. And I said, oh, well, that explains all this stuff in this SUV. And while we're driving up there, he says to me, this is very close hold information, so don't tell anybody. And so I haven't told anybody until today. But he said that airplane that we all heard was coming in, that they got on the megaphone, said, get away from the building. It was coming to Washington, D.C., and it actually was he said it was going to Camp David, and it was shot down. And I thought, shot down? Shot down by who? He shot down by us, shot down by Air Force F-16s out of Andrews Air Force Base. I said, oh, okay. We have never shot down a commercial airline before over U.S. territory. In fact, we haven't shot one down except for the Vincennes in the Arabian Sea. You'll remember that incident in Iran many years ago, and that was a mistake. For the next 10 days, I was starting to wonder whether there was a conspiracy to cover up the fact that we had shot down a commercial airline, because this FBI agent, who was the chief of counterterrorism, told me that and told me it was close hold. I eventually became convinced that that's not what happened. It was actually taken down by passengers in Pennsylvania, in Shanksville, Pennsylvania. And I became convinced that that was the true story. But it says something about first stories are typically wrong. First reports are typically wrong. Now, it doesn't mean that we didn't try to take that airplane down. This is Lieutenant Heather Penny. She now works for Lockheed Martin. At the time, she was a National Guard F-16 pilot stationed with the Washington, D.C. National Guard. She and her commander, a lieutenant colonel, got in 2 F-16s and flew up to take the 4th airplane down that was still coming to Washington, D.C., that had not responded after the FAA put every other airplane in America down on the ground. And when they were talking about how they were going to take this airplane down, because they didn't have any Sidewinder missiles, they didn't have any way to take it down, he was going to go after the front of the airplane And she was going to go after the back of the airplane, and they were just basically going to take it down by ramming it. That's how they were going to do it. When she took off, she thought, this is the last time I'm going to be able to fly in an airplane. Her father was a United Airlines pilot who was scheduled to fly on 9/11. And when she took off to go take this airplane down, she did not know whether that airplane was being piloted by her father. She knew he was on the East Coast somewhere, that he was flying that day, and she thought, this could be my father that I'm about to kill. This is a Pentagon reconstruction. You can see the rings here pretty easily. E ring, D ring, C ring, B ring, A ring right here. And you can see that the B ring and the A ring were relatively untouched. The reconstruction took less than a year. It took about 11 months to do. And the workers who put this building back together were absolutely committed to make sure that it was fully functional and ready to go before the first anniversary of 9/11. And in fact, it was. This is the memorial that was established afterwards. Has anybody been to it? It's very moving, I believe. It's very symbolic as well. Each of these benches represent one of the victims, either in the building or on the airplane. And if the bench is facing away from the building, it represents those that were in the building facing the airplane. If the bench is facing the building, it represents those victims that were on the airplane. There is a wall there that runs from about 14 inches to 71 inches that represent the ages of the victims. The youngest victim was 14 months old. The oldest victim was in the Pentagon, was 71 years old. And it moves up, and I think there's a marker for each one of those. Each one of these benches has moving water underneath it. The name is inscribed on the bench, and there's a light underneath it. So if you know a victim, you can go sit on that bench in solemn recognition of the victim. Now let me run you through a little analysis, intelligence analysis afterwards. Prior to 9/11, 2 of the 19 terrorists were known to be in the United States, Nawak al-Hamzi and Khalid al-Midhar. They were on the INS watch list, the Immigration Naturalization Service watch list. They were not on any other watch list, but we knew they were in the United States. We didn't know where they were. They're color-coded here for a reason. You'll see how the color coding matches here as I progress through the next couple of slides, and you'll see why that's important. Those 2 individuals bought their airline tickets on August 25th and August 27th. They were both on the airplane that hit the Pentagon. Khalid al-Midhar paid cash for his. Nawak al-Hamzi booked his flight on 2 days later. These are those 2 guys right there, top left with the red circles around them. It may be hard for some of you to see in the back, but the Pentagon airplane is over here. The North Tower of the World Trade Center is here. The South Tower is on the bottom left, and the one who went down in Pennsylvania is on the bottom right. Now, when they purchased their airline tickets, Khalid al-Midhar used what we will call common address number 1 in green, and Nawak al-Hamzi booked his flight using what we will call common address number 2. 3 other terrorists used those same addresses when they purchased their airline tickets. So you can see, of these 5 terrorists, 3 of them used the same one address, and 2 of them used the same address, and 2 of those were known terrorists. So you can see how you could start connecting the dots if you were able to connect the dots. We were not prior to 9/11. We are today. I've identified those. Muhammad Atta was the ringleader of the entire operation up here. Now, Muhammad Atta also used what we will call telephone number 1. And these 5 terrorists used the same telephone number in the purchase of their airline tickets. And had we the ability to connect the dots, we would have seen the connection. You see where I'm going with this? But we didn't have that ability back then. And part of the reason is because of the stovepipes. Here are those 5 individuals. So we had the ability, if we'd had the means, to identify 10 of the 19 terrorists through the connections through either common addresses or common telephone numbers knowing that 2 of them were terrorists. But we didn't do that. So prior to 9/11, there were what I will call stovepipes. The federal government, the Department of Defense, the intelligence community, state, local government, science and technology, and the private sector. And I call them stovepipes because they didn't really talk to each other. And after 9/11, we formed what we call the Department of Homeland Security. But it didn't stand up for 14 or 15 months. It was established on 1 March 2003. In that interim period, they created the Office of Homeland Security, which had no budget and no authority. And they hoped that nothing would happen. They did the best they possibly could. I was part of all that at that time, so I remember it was not easy to make sure everything was protected. So this is Senator Phil Graham. He said, "We all lust for the day when the lion and the lamb lie together, but when that day comes, I want to be the lion." And I agree with him. I know you've got a hard stop at 8:30. I'm going to stop here and take any questions you might have. Or if somebody wants to tell their story, if it's compelling. Yes, sir.
You mentioned the conspiracy theorists, of whom I am not one, but it seems to be that people say, well, there's only one picture, that still photo you showed, and the argument seems to be, this is Washington, D.C., it's the Pentagon, there ought to have been so many camera angles. I realize it's 20 years ago, but what do you say to people who say, why aren't there more pictures?
Yeah, so back then, we did have cameras, security cameras, 24 hours, 7 days a week, in and around the Pentagon. That was the only camera which had an angle, and there's a video of that, actually. Now, the airplane moves very fast, but when you slow the screen down, you can actually see the airplane coming in, and that is just a snapshot of one screen and so forth. We've come a long way since then. We are a country, I believe, that is not as comfortable with cameras being everywhere as some other places. Those of you that have been to England or places like London know there's a camera on every corner. You can't move in London without being seen. And they do that because of the counterterrorism concerns they have with the IRA and so forth, many, many years more than we have with terrorism and so forth. So there are a lot more cameras now than there were back then. But you know, some communities bristle at the thought that there's a camera on a red light at an intersection, which is very common in Europe. And I lived 10 years in Europe, and I've got a few tickets from going too fast or going through a stop sign like I should and so forth. And a picture took my, or a camera took my picture. So, yeah. But it was an airplane, believe me. Anybody else? Well, they're anxious to get on to the rest of the day, I guess. All right.